الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيبنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته ومن اهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين. تركنا عن محجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. ثم أما بعد, all praises due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord and Sustainer of all the worlds. We beseech Him for forgiveness, and we implore Him to offer His manifest blessings and salutations upon His last and final Prophet, Muhammad ﷺ, and upon His wives, His companions, His kin, and all those who follow His guidance to the last day. He has left for us a clear, pristine path. Its day is its night in its clarity, and all who swerve from it will only find perdition. So, inshallah, we'll continue. I believe this is the 5th session for the abridgment of Sahih Imam al-Bukhari, as abridged by the great Imam of Hadith and also of the spiritual sciences, Imam Abdullah ibn Abi Jamrah, rahimahullah. And so today we will start with the 6th or the 7th Hadith that was included by the Imam in his Mukhtasar, and it's narrated by Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu. عن أبو هريرة رضي الله عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال: إن الدين يسر ولن يشاد الدين أحد إلا غلبه فسددوا وقاربوا وأبشروا واستعينوا بالغدوة والروحة وشيء من الدلجة. So this hadith narrated by Abu Hurairah رضي الله عنه, commonly referred to as الدين إن الدين يسر hadith, or the deen is ease, and roughly translated, he says on the authority of the Prophet ﷺ that he said ﷺ, that the deen is facilitation, or the deen is ease, and none will try to encompass all of what the deen has except that it will overcome him. فَسَدِّدُوا, so try to be balanced and try to draw near, and وَأَبْشِرُوا, have glad tidings, and seek something of the ghudwa, which is a time of day, وَالرَّوْحَةِ وَشَيْءٍ مِنَ الدُّلْجَةِ, so the ghudwa is the period of time from between Fajr until sunrise. وَالرَّوْحَة is technically anything from Dhuhr to Maghrib, but what's implied here is the time immediately preceding Maghrib, or some time between Asr and Maghrib. And then شَيْءٍ مِنَ الدُّلْجَةِ, something from the dulja, or something from al-dulja here is the night. And this hadith we can point to as being one of the several hadith where we see the balanced and moderate practice of the Prophet ﷺ. And here in this particular one, he's expressing it in terms of words. Other hadith, we see it in terms of actions. One of them that comes to mind is the hadith of the 3 who heard about the Prophet ﷺ, and then one of them, they wanted to reach the epitome in their ibadah, in their devotional acts of worship. And so one of them said, I will pray all night and never sleep, and another said, I will be celibate and never marry, and a third one said that I will fast every day without breaking my fast. And so when the Prophet ﷺ heard about them, and they actually had retreated to some outlying area, they weren't in the Medina, in the city itself, but they even sort of led a monastic type of life. The Prophet ﷺ, he said to them that I marry women, and I also sleep some of the night, and I pray some of the night, and I fast some days and I don't fast other days, and this is my sunnah. وَمَنْ رَغَبَ عَنْ سُنَّتِي فَلَيْسَ مِنِّي, and this is my sunnah, and whoever finds that this sunnah is non-desirous to him, then he is not from me. And so we have to keep in mind that the Prophet ﷺ, first and foremost, huwa musharri', and musharri' means that he was one who brought a sharia with him, a sharia to be followed and emulated by others after him. We can point to singular acts amongst some of the Sahaba and even some of the Tabi'een after the Prophet ﷺ, who seemingly seem to exceed the Prophet ﷺ in some of the devotional acts in terms of quantity. So in terms of sadaqat, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, at one time he gave away all of his wealth to the sadaqah, to the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when the Prophet ﷺ asked him, "What have you left for your family?" he said, "I left for them Allah and His Prophet ﷺ." And so that's an action that is something we can say of a karama, or a type of saintly miracle, or a type of khususiyya, something specific to Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And we see that the Quran, for example, says not to spend all that what you have, and not to hold back all that what you have. وَابْتَغِ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ سَبِيلًا, but seek a middle path, a moderate path between the two. Another example, we see Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, when he made his hijrah from Mecca to al-Medina, he did it in a very one could say courageous manner, so to speak, or in a way that was very blatant and outright, where he exited from his house and went to the area around the Kaaba where the Quraysh were gathering, or were gathered, and he said, "I am now going to Mecca. I'm making the hijrah, and whoever is interested in stopping me, they can meet me behind this mountain as I go." And of course, no one had the courage to meet Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu under those terms, under those conditions. And yet we find the Prophet ﷺ, when he made his hijrah, he took various precautions. He had Sayyidina Ali lie in his bed that night so that the Quraysh would think that he had not left, and even he was given a mu'jiza, one of the miracles, when he actually exited from the house and he threw dust upon the foreheads of the Quraysh assassins who were awaiting him outside his house, and they did not see him, or they were blinded momentarily and did not see him. He chose to take a different direction. He didn't head directly towards Medina, but he took a different route. He should have headed directly north, but he actually headed a little bit south in order to throw them off the path, and he stayed out there for 3 nights. And he had the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anha, Asma, Dhul Natiqain, the one of the Awdat al-Natiqain, the one of the 2 knots, because she tied the provisions for her father and for the Prophet ﷺ in 2 knots around her waist, and she would bring them the provisions during those 3 nights, and then they also hid in the cave that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even caused for the spider cobweb to be covered over, and so that they wouldn't be seen. They took a different path than usually taken. When they did start out to Medina, they took the seaside, or the seacoast path, which is a less traveled route and is not the route that's known. So all of these precautions, we can see that the Prophet ﷺ, the way he made hijrah, was quite different. But no one can claim that Umar radiallahu anhu was more courageous than the Prophet ﷺ. No one can claim that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu was more generous than the Prophet ﷺ. But the Prophet ﷺ, his sunnah is what defines who he is, and what defines ultimately who we are and who we can be. And so by following that sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, then that is the best path. And the things that happened with some of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, and even others after them, these are exceptional circumstances which are sort of, you can think of spiritual gifts that Allah gives to whom He pleases, but not all spiritual gifts that one may receive are necessary to be emulated by others. And that's an important point, because we see a lot of people today taking a particular path, a particular way in terms of their ibadah, and in terms of the way they view their deen and how they practice their deen, and they're taking that particular way and trying to sort of apply it and insist upon it for everyone else, when it may not be suitable for everyone else. The deen is very vast. It accommodates all of humanity, and it's very flexible in that sense. And so to insist on a particular way at the expense of other acceptable ways would be something of tashaddud, or even the common word that we use is extremism. So extremism is not to follow your deen too closely, but extremism is to insist on a particular path that isn't necessarily the only path. And so to sort of have ta'assub, to have a sort of bias to the way that you understand and exclude other acceptable ways that are interpretations of how one's ibadah should go or one's deen is the problem, is the issue. So this hadith here, narrated by Abu Hurairah anhu, very emphatically says in the beginning, Inna ad-deena yusr, that this deen is yusr. And the Shaykh in his commentary, Ibn Abu Jamrah, on this, the idea of how is the deen yusr, how is the deen ease, he talks about 8 or 9 different ways that the deen is of ease. I won't mention all of them here, but just to name a few, one of the ways that, or one of the ways by which it can be considered that the deen is a deen of ease, if we compare it to the other shara'a. Here, if we take deen to mean sharia, or to mean the actual legal and lawful practice of how to do ibadah and how to do mu'amalat, interactions and transactions with others, then no question that this deen is of ease and it's much facilitated as compared to the other shara'a, to the other legal systems and ways of doing devotional acts that came with the other prophets. Most notably, if we compare it with the prophets of Bani Israel, who included the vast majority of the 25 prophets that are mentioned in the Quran, and they included everyone from some of the sons of Abraham, such as Ishaq and Yaqub, his son, and Musa and Isa and Dawood and Sulaiman, amongst others. All of these were prophets to Bani Israel, or the people of Israel, and their sharia was a much more difficult sharia than the sharia of our Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, than the Muhammadan sharia. And we know that our sharia, as the Prophet ﷺ mentions, where he says, Khayruddin al-Sharia Sahla Samiha, or Sharia Samiha, that the best deen is the tolerant and facilitated sharia. In other words, one that's more accommodating. And we see that in the other previous shara'ah. To give just a few examples, the Bani Israel had, for example, the day of the Sabbath, which they were not allowed to hunt, they were not allowed to do many things, and which even till this day many of them observe that Sabbath. But the idea of have a complete day that you are not allowed to engage in any of your mundane affairs was something specific to Bani Israel, and this was something that was lifted from our ummah, that we don't have to contend with. Even the way that we perform our prayers, the Prophet ﷺ said about his sharia, or about himself, his prophethood, جُعِلَتْ لِي الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا وَطُهُورًا, that the whole earth has been made for me a masjid, a place of prayer where I can go and make sujood, and tuhura, and also a means of purification, of ritual purification, which is referring to tayammum. So we don't have particular place where we have to pray. The Bani Israel, they had to pray in their mihrab, in their particular prayer niche. Our Sharia states that we can pray anywhere, virtually anywhere, as long as it's free of najasa. And we see that the tayammum, so when you have lack of water and you're unable to use it, that you can use something of the earth to also ritually purify yourself, and in order to pray. The Bani Israel did not have such a recourse. In fact, they would have to repeat their prayers if they were traveling somewhere. When they got home, they'd have to pray all of those prayers that they missed, even if it was for months, in that particular prayer niche. They didn't have the idea of izalat al-najasa, or the removal of najasa from clothing. Rather, the clothing was to be discarded, or that piece that became najasa, had najasa on it, or filth, was to be cut out of the clothing. And then their dietary restrictions were much more restrictive than ours. And so there are no niqam, there are no things in our sharia that are merely there to purposely just to make our life a little bit difficult, or to try us, or to put us in tribulation. All of the sharia, all of the ahkam, all of the rulings are hikam. All of them have eternal wisdoms behind them, whether we understand them or we don't understand them. But our ulama have told us that every single ruling in the deen, there is even a dunyawi reason behind it that goes and even helps our our dunya, and it's not merely meant as a type of punishment for us, but rather it's all for our own well-being. And the Quran mentions this in several ways, in some of the various ayahs, such as that all the طيبات أحل لكم الطيبات وأحرم عليكم الخبائث ويضع عنهم الأزار التي كان عليهم. So the Prophet came and all of the طيبات are made halal. So anything that's considered طيب or good, in other words, its good exceeds its bad, it's طيب, it's a good thing, and so that's going to be halal. And anything that is khabith, or where its bad exceeds its good, then that's considered something that is bad, and then that would be haram. And this was part of the mission, especially of the Sharia of the Prophet ﷺ. Another way that the deen is yusr is that we have something called rukhsa and we have something called azima. Namely, there are general precepts that we have to follow when we're doing our ibadah, when fasting and hajj and so forth like that. But for those who are unable, for those who have a valid excuse, a legitimate excuse that renders them unable to perform a particular ibadah or a particular act or a particular facet of an act of worship, then the Sharia allows a dispensation or a rukhsa in order for them to still perform that ibadah. So generally speaking, in the fard prayers, one has to stand during the qiyam, the recitation of al-Fatiha, and if need be in the first two rak'ahs of the multiple rak'ah prayers of the surah after. But if someone is unable to stand, then they may lean on something. If one is unable to lean on something, one may sit. If one is unable to sit, then one may lay down. If one is unable to actually move, then one could, in their own position, pray and just move their eyes. If they can't move even their eyes in the direction of sujood and ruku', then they don't have to move their eyes. And so the Sharia allows for this, for people to still practice their ibadah, even though they may have extenuating circumstances that would render it quite difficult for them. And so that's a type of a facilitation, a type of ease for us. The deen is also considered ease in the sense that we're only taking into account in those things that we actually do, and those sin. We mentioned this last week about ilham when we talked about the two men who come to blows with their swords, al-qatil wal-maqtul fi an-nar. Then الثاني كان يعزم على قتل أخيه, because the second one has a azm, he was intending to kill his brother, but if it's less than something that comes in between you and your intention, but namely just merely hem, or just a thought, a passing thought, and you actually decide not to go through with it, then it's not written down for you as a sin, it's not taken into account. And on the reverse of that, if you have an intention to do something of khair, and then something comes between you and that khair, then your intention, it's as if you have done it. And even the hadith that points out to this, نية المؤمن خير من عمله, that the intention of the believer is better even than the actual act itself, because with the intention we have تصحيح الأعمال, or what renders valid the acts of worship, and we'll get to that in a later hadith in more detail about that. So there are various ways where we can consider the deen to be yusr, a deen of facilitation, a deen of ease. The next part, وَلَنْ يُشَادَ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَهُ. Right? So here is a warning to those who think that they can perform everything and all of the mandub, or all of the acts that the deen not requires us to do but encourage us to do. And here the ulama, they refer to this as tanattu'. In one of the other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, هَلَكَ الْمُتَنَطِّعُونَ هَلَكَ الْمُتَنَطِّعُونَ هَلَكَ الْمُتَنَطِّعُونَ. Those who are mutanatti' will be destroyed. And what's meant by al-mutanatti' is the one who is extreme in their approach to their deen, in the sense that they try to take everything in a manner, especially voluntary acts, and they do them to such an extreme manner that it may impinge upon their fara'id or huquq. So not having a proper mizan, not having a proper understanding and balance between fard that which is required you to do, and al-mandub. And this often takes effect when people concentrate much on the ibadat, on the devotional acts, because they're quite tangible and so forth. But sometimes they do it to the extent that they actually are negligent in some of the other furud, some of the other things that are fard upon them. So someone who prays all night in prayer, prays 100 rak'ahs or more in prayer, and then misses Fajr as a result. And this actually happened during the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, that someone who was accustomed to seeing him in the Fajr prayer, and he asked his mother later on how come he didn't come, and she said namat ayna. He said he was praying and then he overslept. He said it would have been better if he didn't pray all of that and came to pray the Fajr prayer with us Jamrah in the masjid. So a form of tanattu' or a form of extremism can be in deen, can be taking the mandub or the nawafil, taking the voluntary acts, the meritorious acts that are not particularly required. They're encouraged, of course, nonetheless, but taking them to an extreme in such a way that you actually wind up losing something or not performing something of the fard. So it could be another ibadah, or it could be even a haqq or a right that someone might have on you. And I think we mentioned this hadith before, where a woman came to the Prophet ﷺ and she was complaining about her husband, and she was somewhat embarrassed, of course, so she said, my husband, mashallah, he fasts all day and he prays all night. And then Umar was actually there and he said, Ni'am al-rajul. He said, what do you have to complain about? And he sounds good. So she repeated it twice and then a third time. And of course the Prophet ﷺ understood what she meant, that he's not giving her marital right in that sense. And so the Prophet ﷺ admonished him and he said that part of your deen is to give every due right its right. And tu'ti kulli dhi haqqin haqqa. Everyone who is due a right from you, you have to give a right to them. And for example, another example, the man who came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked permission to go on jihad with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ asked him, are your mother and your father still alive? And he said yes. He said, then do jihad with them. فَفِيهِمَا جَاهِدْ. Yani then your jihad is with your khidmah, with your service, with your parents. Why? Because there's no one else to serve his parents except him. So it becomes a fard ayn on that particular individual to serve his parents. Whereas the jihad with the Prophet ﷺ, even though it might be more beloved to someone in their heart, right, because it's jihad with the Prophet ﷺ, but the better act for them, because that's a fard kifaya, not everyone had to go, but a certain amount. So for this particular individual, then the remaining with his parents was the more meritorious act. And just as one of the battles, one of the expeditions of the Prophet ﷺ, he left Ali radiallahu anhu in charge of Medina, and even Ali radiallahu anhu was sort of ambivalent. He wanted to go, but he said, isn't it better for you to stay here and represent me while I'm gone? So these are all examples of how seemingly we think that a particular act is better, but always what we have to consider is what is wajib al-waqt, as the ulama say, wajib al-waqt. What is the particular wajib, the particular right, duty, responsibility that I have to be doing right now? And right now doesn't mean right this second, but it means someone in my circumstances, in my position, what is my particular wajib? So someone, for example, there could be a nice gathering of brothers in the masjid on Thursday evenings, and they have dhikr and they have things and reading Quran and nasheed, and that's a meritorious thing to go to. That's a very good thing to go to. But they might have an elderly parent at home, such as they cannot be left by themselves. And so for them, their wajib al-waqt in their particular circumstance is either to find alternate arrangements, or you stay home and take care of those elderly parents. And so that's the sunnah. The sunnah is to assess your situation and see if the Prophet ﷺ was here in my shoes, what would he have chosen? And that's how we see that throughout his sunnah. So the examples I gave before of his balanced approach, he didn't make hijrah the same exact way as Umar, He didn't give sadaqah the same exact way as Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, but nonetheless he was superior to them. And that's the secret of the beauty of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. It's something that we can all aspire to. It's something that we can actually try to implement. Not all of us can be Umar. Not all of us can have that type of courage, and not all of us, or that outward display of courage, so to speak, because he was not more courageous than the Prophet ﷺ. And not all of us will be able to give all of our wealth and have the yaqeen and have the certainty that the Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had when he gave away all of his wealth. But in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we find nothing superior to that. And they also say concerning this part of the hadith, وَلَنْ يُشَادَ الدِّينَ أَحَدٌ إِلَّا غَلَبَ, that those people, or those who sort of take this approach to the deen, they rarely continue. And they even have a saying, مَنْ تَنَطَّعَ انْقَطَعَ, مَنْ تَنَطَّعَ انْقَطَعَ. Whoever takes a path of tanattu', of this type of extremist approach to the deen, انْقَطَعَ, they will cut off. And maybe not even just cut off from that particular ibadah they were doing, but maybe even from the bounds of the deen itself. And I'm sure many of us have seen people go through that. A lot of enthusiasm in the beginning, if they're newly Muslim or they're newly practicing Muslim, and so they want to do everything which is recommended, or it's a nice thing, but not at the expense of burning out, so to speak, and then afterwards losing sight of all that was there from before. And so the best balance approach is moderate consistency. And this moderate consistency is also mentioned in another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, خير الأعمال أو أحب الأعمال إلى الله عز وجل أدومها وإن قل, that the most beloved of acts to the Prophet, to the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is those that are most consistent, أدومها وإن قل, even if it's something little. So it's better to pray 2 rak'ahs a night, sometime before Fajr every morning, or most of the mornings, even if it's 10 minutes before, than to pray 100 rak'ahs once in a year, on one night in Ramadan, and then you don't do anything for the rest of the nights. Because the idea behind the ibadat is that ultimately they are wasa'il. They are means by which to cleanse our souls, by which to purify our souls. And so when you want to cleanse something, if you throw it in the wash just once and then you take it out and leave it out the rest of the year, and then all the filth accumulates on it, you haven't really cleansed it. But if every day you sprinkle a little bit and you rub a little bit and you wash a little bit, then it will remain clean, it will remain purified for that whole year. And so the idea is to have a more moderate approach in everything we do, in terms of our sadaqah, in terms of our prayer, in terms of our siyam, to find it and then to be consistent about it, and then not to give up on it, and not to sacrifice it for anything else that comes in the way. And that means doing it even when you don't really feel the impetus. You don't really feel like doing it, but nonetheless, you find that you do it anyway. You treat it like you treat the 5 prayers. We don't always feel like praying sometimes, but we know that ultimately we have to pray the 5 prayers. And so the Sahaba approach even to their ibadah was that they didn't differentiate too much between what was fard, what was sunnah. They did the sunnah in as much as they can do, and they were consistent with it. So consistency is the key. Then the last part of the hadith actually is it's sort of a, how they say in Arabic, a tasliyah. It actually gives you hope in the sense that the Prophet ﷺ, he's outlined even particular times of day that where you can find a lot, where you can pick up a lot. So he says, فَسَدِّدُوا وَقَارِبُوا وَأَبِشِرُوا. So 3 things here. So at-tasdeed, when he says فَسَدِّدُوا, means to be moderate, to be correct, to not leave any gaping holes, so to speak, in your approach. وَقَارِبُوا, in other words, qaribu, draw near to the sunnah, draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in as much as you can. And here waqaribu, sort of, it's an indication that perfection is impossible. You try to near it, you try to draw close, but ultimately no one can be perfect, no one can be absolutely perfect in their ibadah and their devotional acts, but it's a mithal, it's an example that we try to reach. وَأَبِشِرُوا, right? So if you have tasdeed and you have qurb or muqaraba, you're trying to get close, then you can have this bushra, then you can have these glad tidings, these good signs that Allah is giving you if you are muwaffaq, if you are successful in being moderate and drawing near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by using the sunnah of His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then where he says وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالْغُدْوَةِ, وَاسْتَعِينُوا is isti'ana, the same verb that we see in Surah Al-Fatiha, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, to we only worship you and we only ask you for isti'ana, or for aid or for help. So seek aid by means of, here the ba isti'ana, by means of bil-ghudwati wal-rawha. So al-ghudwa is the time of day, as I mentioned at the beginning of the hadith, that is between fajr, the fajr time, and the sunrise. And in most locales it's not going to be after you have finished praying fajr. Probably the time that's left over is an hour or less. And so that 1 hour or less in that particular time of day is a type of mubarak time. There's an extra blessing and barakah in that time that you may not find in other times of the day. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, جُعِلَتْ بَرَكَةُ أُمَّتِي فِي بُكُورِهَا, that the barakah of my ummah is in its bukur, and it's rising early and starting their day early. And so devoting that time to dhikr, to reading of Quran, to tasbih, and so forth, and it's not that much time anyway, it will have many folds of reward coming back to you, not just in the akhirah but in the dunya. You'll find that it's a blessed time. It's easy to make a dhikr at that time. It's easier to memorize Quran, or easier to memorize Quran if you want to at that time, which is right after the finishing the Fajr prayer all the way until sunrise. And then after you have finished and the sun rises, you wait 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then you pray the duha prayer, 2 to 4 to 8 rak'ahs, whatever you feel comfortable with, and be consistent with it. And then you start your day. And imagine if you started your day that way every day. You know, you say your Fajr prayer, and then you stay and you do the dhikr that's after the prayer, then the dhikr that's specific to that time, which is Adhkar al-Sabah, you know, the dhikr of the Sabah, of the morning time. And there are variants upon it that you can find, but most all of them include all of the hadith that were narrated that the Prophet ﷺ, he himself said. And then by saying that, you then read some Quran and try to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then you wait a little bit, the sun rises, and then you pray your duha prayer. Imagine if you did that every day, and every day you started out your day this way. And I think that's the meaning of Ju'alat barakat ummati fi bukuriha, and they're starting out early. وَالرَّوْحَةِ, the rawha is another time of day. Again, it's the time before Maghrib, right before Maghrib, so it could be just minutes, or it could be longer than that, any time from after Asr all the way until Maghrib. Again, it doesn't have to be that long a time. We could be talking an hour or less, or half an hour even. And to devote that time also to remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and using it for dhikr and things like this would be a very meritorious thing. The Adhkar al-Masa, the litany of the evening, is usually recited at this time, which would be before Maghrib, not after Maghrib, because once Maghrib comes in, then the night has begun, and so it's sort of a way for it to bring in the night, or to introduce the night, that you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the changing of the day and the changing of the night. Doing it in the morning, right before sunrise, when day turns into night, and then right before sunset, when the night comes upon the day. So these are Mubarak times, as mentioned here. And then he says, وَشَيْءٍ مِنَ الدُّلْجَةِ, شَيْءٍ مِنَ الدُّلْجَةِ, and the dulja, we said, is the night. So something from the night. And some of them, the linguists, they said al-dulja actually means the last part of the night. And if we look to the Ahadith, we see generally it's talking about the last third of the night or the last sixth of the night, something like this. And the way you figure out the length of the night, you take from Maghrib all the way until the Fajr time and see how many hours that is. If it's 12, then you're talking anywhere from, about 3 hours or 4 hours from before the Fajr comes in. And so something of the night, doesn't say all night, one need not stand all night in prayer, but some part of the night. So just as Surah Al-Sajda says, تَتَجَافَى جُنُوبُهُمْ عَنِ الْمَضَاجِعِ, يعني their bodies rise and it becomes it has a dry feeling by remaining in bed, and then it seeks its satiation, or seeks its sustenance by rising from the bed. And so the act of leaving your sleep, leaving your ladha, leaving your pleasurable state, leaving what's comfortable, leaving what's your habit, leaving all those things, praying in the night and waking up to pray in the night signifies all of those things. And so that's why such a great reward has been attached to it, because it's an ultimate test for the nafs, because you're leaving and you're putting aside all of the things that the nafs loves. And by doing that, if you can defeat the nafs in this particular instant, then it'll be that much easier to defeat the nafs in other instances, in other places, in other times of day, other times of in your life and other circumstances that may come up. So shay'in min ad-dulja, something of the night. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. I think we can move on to the next hadith, inshallah, which is narrated by Ibn Abbas, عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما قال إن وفد عبد القيس لما أتوا النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من القوم أو من الوفد؟ قالوا ربيعة. قال مرحبا بالقوم أو بالوفد غير خزايا ولا ندامة. فقالوا يا رسول الله إنا لا نستطيع أن نأتيك إلا في الشهر الحرام وبيننا وبينك هذا الحي من كفار مضر فمرنا بأمر فصل نخبر به من وراءنا وندخل به الجنة. وسألوه عن الأشربة فأمرهم بأربع ونهاهم عن أربع. أمرهم بالإيمان بالله وحده. قال أتدرون ما الإيمان بالله وحده؟ قالوا الله ورسوله أعلم. قال شهادة أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمد رسول الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة صيام رمضان وأن تعطوا من المغنم الخمس. ونهاهم عن أربع، عن الحنتم وعن الدباء والنقير والمزفت، وربما قال المقير، وقال احفظوهن واخبروا بهن من وراءكم. So the longest or second longest hadith that we've come across so far after the first hadith, Hadith Bad al-Wahi, and this hadith narrated by Ibn Abbas said that when the delegation of the tribe of Banu Abdul Qais came to the Prophet ﷺ, he asked them who are or what is the delegation. They said Rabi'a, and he said welcome to this people or this delegation, al-Qawm, or the wafd or the delegation. And he said, may you not suffer disgrace nor regret. They said, oh, Messenger of Allah, we only came to you in the sacred months, since there is a district of the unbelievers of Mudar between us and you. Give us some clear instructions which we can convey to those who we left behind, and by which we may enter paradise. And they asked him about drinks, about what they should drink or not drink, and the Prophet ﷺ commanded them to do 4 things and forbade them to do 4 things. He commanded them to believe in Allah alone and asked them, do you know what belief in Allah alone is? And they said, Allah and His Messenger know best. He said to testify there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, and to establish the prayers, pay zakah, fast Ramadan, and to pay the 5th or khumus, which is referring to the 5th of war booty. And he forbade them 4 things, and these are 4 different types of vessels on which they would drink their intoxicating drink or their wine, which is al-Hantam, wal-Dubba, wal-Naqir, wal-Muzaffat, or wal-Muqayyar. And then he said, remember these and convey them to the people you left behind. So the commentary on this hadith states that this group came to the Prophet ﷺ in the 8th year of the Hijrah, which is also commonly known as Am al-Wufud. Am al-Wufud, or the year of the delegations. And they were perhaps one of the first of the Wufud, one of the first delegations to come to the Prophet ﷺ. And this happened a short time after Fath Mecca, after the conquest of Mecca. Many of the tribes who are in the outlying areas of the Arabian Peninsula were sort of, I guess, for lack of a better term, sitting the fence, so to speak, to see whether Muhammad ﷺ and his followers will be able to overcome Quraysh, or whether they will not be able to overcome Quraysh. And so many of them waited for this to happen, and then when they find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted victory to the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, many of them then gave their bay'ah, or their allegiance, and came to al-Medina, or sent representatives to come to al-Medina to bear their oath of allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ. And this particular tribe, Bani Abdul Qais and the sub-tribe of Rabi'ah, it said that one of them, before this delegation went to the Prophet ﷺ, he actually came, and this is related by Shaykh al-Azhar Muhammad al-Shanawani rahimahullah, that he came and he met the Prophet, or he met some of the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ, and he became Muslim on that. And then something was written for him to take back to his people. And so when he went back to them, his tribe of Rabi'ah, he actually kept the letter to himself, and he didn't show it to anyone else. And then his wife would see him doing strange things, or what she thought would be strange things, such as getting up early in the night and praying and doing the things that Muslims would be doing. And so she mentioned this to her father, and he was one of the chieftains of the tribe of Rabi'ah. And then she found the letter, the note that was given to him, and she gave it to her father. When the father read the note, he read it, and he found that it made a lot of sense to him. It might have been some of the basic precepts of Islam. It doesn't mention specifically what was written in it, but he accepted Islam on that point. And actually the whole tribe accepted Islam, and none of them had ever really met the Prophet ﷺ. And it's narrated that they were actually the first outlying tribe to have accepted Islam. And they were actually quite far from al-Hijaz, from Mecca and Medina. They were from the area of what was called back then al-Bahrain. Bahrain now has the meaning for that small island country in the Eastern Gulf, but Bahrain used to mean the whole eastern seaboard of the Arabian Gulf. So it would include now, from the north, including parts of eastern Saudi Arabia, like al-Ahsa region, and going all the way down to including what's now Bahrain and Qatar and the 7 Emirates, and even down to southern beginning of Oman. So that whole area, that whole eastern seaboard, was known as al-Bahrain. And so they were from that area. And so they had to traverse the whole width of the peninsula to get to the Prophet ﷺ. And as we know, the idea of the sacred months, and namely the month of Rajab al-Fard, Rajab, it's by itself, and then came Sha'ban, Ramadan, were not sacred months. In other words, fighting did go on during those 2 months. And then the last 3 of Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, and Muharram. So that made the 4 sacred months. And so to traverse the whole width of the peninsula, especially in a month like Rajab, to go and come back was not feasible for the people who lived there. It was a very harsh desert they had to go across. They had to go across of what we now come to call the empty quarter, which is a vast desert that is quite difficult. So there are only certain pathways, certain routes which they can take. And of course, the warring tribes that they mentioned here in this hadith of Mudar knew those particular routes. And so they, and Mudar actually is it's a big tribe, and there are many sub-tribes under Mudar, so they weren't specific in exactly which tribe of Mudar, but they said the people of Mudar, the people from that large tribe that were in between them and al-Hijaz in Mecca and Medina. And so when they came, this man, and they became Muslim, they all became Muslim, and the Prophet ﷺ heard about this and knew about it, that they had all become Muslim. And so when he asked, he said, "Man al-qawm or man al-wafd?" Who are the group or the delegation? Again, as we mentioned in a previous hadith, this shak or doubt about what was said exactly came from either Ibn Abbas or the one before Ibn Abbas, the Rawi, because again they wanted to be very precise and specific in how they relate the hadith. So they said, what is the group, or what is the delegation? And so they said the Rabi'a, which is a sub-tribe of Abdul Qais. So he said, "Marhaban bil qawm aw al-wafd." So he welcomed them because he knew that this tribe had come. And actually the way that al-Shanawani relates and how they actually came is that the Quraysh, the chieftain of the tribe, who was the father-in-law that we mentioned before of the man, he was said to be sort of smallish in stature and maybe even not a very attractive type of man. So he waited all the way in the back, and all the rest, they all came. The whole tribe came. So women and children and those who couldn't walk, and it's described that even those who were even crawling and on canes and struggling just to meet the Prophet. Just to meet the Prophet ﷺ, and then they came, and they some of them they kissed his hand, and this man was in the back, and so the Prophet ﷺ told him to come closer, and so he came closer, and he said, he asked the Prophet ﷺ to forgive him because he thought he wouldn't be the type of person to meet the Prophet ﷺ in that sense. And then the Prophet ﷺ, what was his response? What did he say to him? He said, "You have two traits that Allah and His Prophet love. فِيكَ خَصْلَتَانِ يُحِبُّهُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ." You have two traits that Allah and His Prophet love. And he said, الْحُلْمُ وَالْأَنَاةِ. He said, clemency and temperance. Clemency and temperance. And so then the man asked him, "Are these characteristics that something that I earned or that I learned, or something that's intrinsic in me? Allah put it as an intrinsic, inherent trait in me." And he said, "No, they're inherent traits in me." And then he said, "Alhamdulillah that Allah has put these traits in me, these inherent traits." So from this we can see the beauty of the character of the Prophet ﷺ. This was the chieftain of the tribe, and the Prophet ﷺ praised him and showed him that don't worry about your outward appearance. Outward appearance doesn't mean anything. It means little in the scheme of things. They traversed the desert, and they came with their children, they came with their women, they came crawling, they came struggling, they came walking on their canes. Some were on camelback, some were not, and all this to meet the Prophet ﷺ. And so when the Prophet ﷺ said, "Marhaban bil qawm," welcome to this group or to this particular delegation, غَيْرَ خَزَايَا وَلَا نَدَامًا, right? And he said to them, without regret, or without khazaya, without loss, I think how is it translated here, without disgrace, and without regret. And so some of the commentators mentioned that this was actually a foretelling or a prophecy that the Prophet ﷺ was mentioning here, because he knew that they came in what they had to go, and they came in the sacred month, and they could only stay for a short time, and then they had to go back, so they were able to get back in the same month. I think it's mentioned they came in Rajab. And so when he told them غَيْرَ خَزَايَا, without disgrace, وَلَا نَدَامًا, without regret, that they would suffer neither disgrace nor regret, and so they would be able to defeat that enemy that was stopping them from coming before. And it was as the Prophet ﷺ came, as the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned and that they were able to defeat the people of Mudr. That happened later on when they went back. And also they said غَيْرَ خَزَايَا, that they came into Islam willingly. They weren't one of the tribes that waited all the way until the end, and they weren't one of the tribes that had to be fought, and they weren't one of the tribes that of the apostating tribes that apostated after the death of the Prophet ﷺ and refused to pay the zakah. They were not one of those tribes, and their Islam remained from then until the very day. And so this type of dua, غَيْرَ خَزَايَا وَلَا نَدَامَ, without regret, or without suffering disgrace and without regret, was a type of dua in essence. And it was, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, they did not suffer disgrace, nor did they suffer regret. And then they mentioned their udhr, their excuse, and saying that they cannot come except in the Shahr al-Haram during the sacred month, namely Rajab. And then this group of the kuffar of Mudar were between them and their destination. So they said, give us amrun fasl, something that is of a certain nature, something that's like a summary, a khulasa, that you can give us that will help us when we go back, because we may not know the next time we're able to come, and it might be difficult for us to come thereafter. So it said that and something by which they can enter paradise, and then they asked him about the particular drinks or their drinking vessels. So the first thing that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned to them, or that he ordered of them, أمرهم بالإيمان بالله وحده. And then he asked them, what do you know about Iman, or what Iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and not worshipping anyone else? And they said, Allah and His Messenger know best. And then he mentioned the Shahada, and then he mentioned prayer, then he mentioned Zakah and Ramadan, and then the Khums, or the fifth of the war booty. And it's interesting here that under the understanding of Iman, the Prophet ﷺ not just mentions the Shahadatain, or which reflects one's Iman, but he also mentioned the prayer, Iqam as-Salah, and the Zakah, and the Ramadan, and then the last part, Maghnam min al-Maghnam al-Khumus, which I'll get to in a second. But all those generally we traditionally tend to think that they're part of Islam, part of the outward aspect of the deen, but really they reflect the inward aspect of the deen. The inner core of the deen, which is your ikhlas, your sincerity, and your jawarah, where your limbs merely reflect what's going on inside. Just like when the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, إن في الجسد مضغة إذا صلحت صلحت الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب, that within the body there is a morsel of flesh, that if it becomes corrected and purified, then the whole body will be corrected and purified. And he said, verily this is the heart. And with the heart here, he didn't mean the pumping vessel that distributes blood and circulates blood throughout the circulatory system in the body, but he meant al-Jawhar al-Latif, or that subtle otherworldly aspect to our souls, to our hearts, that ultimately determine the type of people that we truly are. And so if that inner aspect of one, if the batin becomes purified, then the zahir, then the outside becomes purified as well. So he described Iman as including fasting and zakah and Ramadan. One might ask, usually the 5 pillars, when we hear them, also includes Hajj. He did not mention Hajj here. There's one of 2 possible reasons. One is that Hajj wasn't an obligation yet. They came during the 8th year of the Hijrah, and the Prophet ﷺ made his Hajj in the 9th year, and that's when it became an obligation, a farida, upon the Muslims, so it had not become an obligation. Or, as I said in the previous hadith about the deen being yusr, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the deen being yusr, of ease and facilitation, and that one of the aspects, one of the conditions for Hajj is that you have the means to be able to do so, and that means not just financial means, but physical means. So if in between you and Hajj is like an enemy who would stop you and cause loss of life or loss of wealth, loss of property, and other type of strife, then you wouldn't be required to go to Hajj in that sense. So perhaps for that reason, if we go by the opinion that Hajj actually was followed before this, then it would be that that was a dispensation, and so there wasn't a need to mention to them specifically Hajj at this time. Or if we go by the opinion that Hajj became fard in the 9th year of the Hijrah, then the reason for that is it was not exactly fard upon them yet. وَأَن تُعْطُوا مِنَ الْمَغْنَمِ الْخُمُسِ, and then to give from the maghnam, from the war booty, the fifth. And the fifth here goes to the state or to the imam of the Muslims, and that's anything that's recovered from as war booty, as anfal, from the persons or from the material of the enemy. And so there's probably, not to my knowledge, another hadith that groups the khumus in this sense with iman and fasting and praying and so forth. So again, this brings up a question that might perk some of our curiosity. Why did he specifically mention this? And then if we go back to the beginning where he mentioned غَيْرَ خَزَايَا وَلَا نَدَامَ, without suffering disgrace or remorse, and the fact that they mentioned that they're enemy of Mudar in between, then this is another sort of foretelling that they will come to battle with their enemy of Mudar and they will defeat them, and that there will be a maghnam, there will be a war booty that they will have to pay the fifth from. And so here, this order also goes back to what we were talking about before, from wajib al-waqt, from the wajib, the responsibility, the haqq, the obligation of your particular circumstances. So for their circumstances, Hajj, for whatever reason, was an obligation, for one of the two reasons that we mentioned before, but giving the fifth from al-maghnam, giving the fifth from the war booty, was to be an obligation, or in the near future was to be an obligation. So he mentioned this specifically to them, wallahu a'lam. And then the last thing was about the 4 different types of vessels that they were accustomed to, and they specifically asked about it, because it says in the hadith, وَسَأَلُوهُ عَنِ الْأَشْرِبَةِ, right? They asked him about ashrib, about drinking. And we know that for the Arabs in general, that drinking wine was probably their favorite pastime. They used to have nawadi, like sort of drinking sessions, and even there was a particular name for the drinking buddy called the nadim, who would be the one that would share in the drink of intoxicating alcohol, or whether it be wine or some other form of intoxicating drink, either made from dates or otherwise. And so they had even particular vessels made from different things, sometimes made from the bark of the palm tree, sometimes made from a type of tar-like material, that's al-muzaffat, sometimes al-muqayyar, which is something that's sort of tried or lined by fire with some type of material from the outside of it. So all of these things were different types of vessels by which they would drink the alcohol from. And so Prophet ﷺ, he told them to avoid all of these. In other words, he was trying to tell them that any form of alcohol, any form of intoxicating drink, whatever vessel that you may be drinking it in, is prohibited for you. And we can see that the Prophet ﷺ specifically mentioned this in response to their question. And also, remember the idea of wajib al-waqt, and there's also the particular circumstances of a people. So it's more than likely that they were a people who were engaged in drinking alcohol to some extent. And so for them, it was particularly important that this was brought up specifically, and they asked about it. So the Prophet ﷺ specifically prohibited them when they asked from drinking in these particular vessels. Allahu Ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. That's coming just upon an hour of the session, so I think we will stop here and take some questions if there are any, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. In relation to the hadith, how can one balance taking the deen with ease but increasing one's worship without overwhelming oneself? Well, I would say the best thing is that our deen is not a do-it-yourself type of deen. It's not something where you have to try to figure out everything all by yourself. It's always good to have someone who's more learned or in a position to be able to advise you, someone who's more familiar with your particular circumstances. And usually we call this person the Shaykh, or the one who sort of acts as a guide. And the importance of the Shaykh is that, well, there's no disagreement about everyone has to do the fara'id from even the first day that they practice their Islam, or the first day that they become Muslim. So they have to do the 5 prayers, and if Ramadan comes about, they have to fast on Ramadan. If they have the nisab and the year passes, then on their wealth they have to pay the zakah and so forth. If they have the means to go to Hajj, they should go to Hajj. If they're married, or they're going to be in a marriage, then they need to know the rights and duties of marriage. If they are owners of a business, or are going to own a business, or are doing some type of commercial activity, then they have to be aware of some of the ahkam, the rulings that pertain to their trade or to their commercial activity and so forth. So all of those where there's no disagreement, or there's not too much ambiguity about it. But the mandubat, in other words, those things where are optional, I don't like to use the word optional, I would say those things that are, we have a bit of freedom of choice, or in terms of how much we do, or how little, and when, and how, and so forth. It's always best to follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ as close as we can, in as much as we can. And so we have the rawatib, we have the prayers that are prayed before and after some of the fard prayers. So it's always best to start with those strong sunnahs. Some of the madhahib call them sunan al-mu'akkada, other madhahib call it just sunnah, whatever the terminology may be, but to those things that are very strong, firm sunnahs, that's basically where we should start. That's in terms of what we do. We should also not forget that a lot of the deen is about what we restrain ourselves from, or what we choose to forsake and abandon, because we have wajibat and we have muharramat. We have things that are obligations and responsibilities, and also things that are muharramat, things that we have to stay away from. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was very clear when he said, مَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْهُ فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ, that which I have prohibited from you, stay away from it. وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَأْتُوا بِهِ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, and that which I have asked you to do, then do as much as you can, because the things that we have been asked to do consist of obligations, and they also consist of mandubat, or things that are meritorious but not in the same category as an obligation. So the actual biggest obligation is to leave out all those things that are haram, to leave out all those things that are prohibited for us from doing, and that's the first step. And another way of looking at it is that the first maqam, or the first place you have to go through, that will always be with you, is the maqam of tawbah, of repentance. And all of us are repenters, as Imam al-Ghazali says. Everyone is in a state, or in a maqam of tawbah, because everyone always makes mistakes. No one is free from mistakes except the prophets, and of course our prophet being the foremost amongst them, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But outside of that, all the rest of us, we make mistakes. And so if we have mistakes that are made, then we have things that we need to repent from. So tawbah, or repentance, it's a constant maqam, or station that's with us all the time. No matter where we go after that, still we're always going to be in a consistent state of tawbah. So that's much more important than the the actual extra acts of worship and a'mal that we do. And I'm reminded of a particular saying that's often attributed to Abu Hassan al-Shadhili rahimahullah, and sometimes to Imam al-Junayd rahimahullah, that says من دلك على العمل فقد أتعبك ومن دلك على الله فقد نصحك. He who guides you to al-amal, or to extra devotional acts, has tired you out, and he who guides you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has truly counseled you. So that means that the ultimate idea, the goal, is to go towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And acts of worship are a means by which to do that, but they're not the only means. There are other means. Staying away from haram, restraining oneself from illicit glances, removing those things in one's life that sort of cause them to trip up, avoiding situations that you know where you might trip up, to give the rights of others as much as you can. All of us are generally in a position where we're someone's son or daughter, or someone's husband or wife, or someone's father or mother, or someone's friend, or someone's neighbor. All of these different roles in life, they have particular rights and duties that we should be well aware of. And these are obligations. These are not even in the mandub category. So it's very important that we become aware of them, and I think that's where we start. And I think if we start there, then we'll have very productive lives, inshallah, and very successful lives and successful akhirah, bi'idhnillah. In terms of worship, I think if we stick to what was mentioned in the hadith, it's a good start to pick certain times of the day and treat it like an appointment. Don't sacrifice it for anything. And most people don't have appointments that early in the morning after Fajr. So if you can stay awake from the time you pray Fajr until sunrise and then pray the duha at the basic minimum, this would be a good way to start. And that would mean that you don't stay up late too much at night, so that in the next morning you miss Fajr, or you miss waking up a little bit early if you wanted to pray a little bit before Fajr. So it's going to take a little bit of sacrifice and breaking of habits. But there are many distractions nowadays. The time wasters, probably in our age, have never been as vast and expansive, with the internet, with social media, with television and cable television and handheld games and all of these type of things. So I think most of us, if we just cut out on our screen time, which would include our phones and our laptops and our other types of media that we're engaged with, many of us, for hours in the day, just take one of those hours and devote it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think you'll find a big difference. Sometimes it seems hard to balance all of the rights people have upon us, such as that it seems almost any mandub or nafil is impinging upon that. Any advice to balance everything well? I don't know if I agree with that statement. Giving people their rights, oftentimes it's just, if it's a wife or a husband, then it's giving them a kind word. It's if you're the husband, then taking care and spending and what needs to be spent on and the house and so forth. And if you're the wife, then also attending to the spouse's needs and the children's needs and so forth. And of course that will take a time, but you are actually ma'jur for that. You are rewarded for that. And so if that's taking up all or most of your time and only leaves a little bit for ibadah, well, that's what the hadith was talking about. It's only talking about particular times of the day, 15 minutes here, 20 minutes there. We might trivialize that, but it's not trivial, because what's your time? It's, hours are made up of minutes, and minutes are made up of seconds, and every second is made up of your breaths, how many breaths that you take, and sooner or later you're going to take your last breath. And so the idea is that when we take our last breath, that we have husn al-khitam, that we are in the best state, we're in a state of Islam, we're in a state that we were doing what we could and as much as we could to fulfill others' rights, and at the same time not neglecting our ibadah, not neglecting our deen and so forth. And all of those things we mentioned already are part of the deen. They're part and parcel of the deen. When we start thinking of ibadah or devotion as deen and then other stuff is not deen, that's, I think, we might get into trouble. But all of it is deen, and perhaps by attending to a sick relative or helping someone in need, right? You gain more from that than many nights of ibadah and many days of fasting. You know, this the miqyas, the measurement is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's something that we can't really try and figure out by ourselves. Allahu a'lam. Where can one find this story about Prophet talking to the father mentioned from Rabi'ah? It's in the Sirah ibn Hisham, and I think you might find it also in Fath al-Bari, which is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's commentary on this particular hadith in Bukhari, and I got it out of al-Shanawani's commentary on the Mukhtasar. Do you have the name of the leader of this tribe? Just give me a second. I don't see the name. His name was al-Ashaj, Hamza Sheen Jeen. And it was mentioned he was not necessarily, I think, the leader of the tribe, but he was from amongst the tribe, from what I just reviewed right now. And that's why he was at the back, but he was the father-in-law of the man who became Muslim initially. So I think those are all the questions for now. So we'll stop here. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Jazakumullah khair. Thank everyone for coming out. It may not be a very convenient time, I think, for people on the East Coast, or maybe a little bit late even for people in the UK. But alhamdulillah that Allah has given us the strength and the ability to continue doing this, and we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He forgive us for our mistakes, things that we have said incorrectly, and that He give all of you all that you desire from the akhirah and from the akhlaq that we all want to imbibe within ourselves, and the akhlaq of the Prophet ﷺ, and that he join us with the Prophet ﷺ both in this lifetime and in the next. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.